Welcome. If you're here, maybe you've felt it too. How the night sometimes leans in, softer than your own breath, asking questions you can't quite name. There's no rush. You can let your mind drift. For a moment, leave behind the clocks, the lists, the steady tick of ordinary hours. Tonight, we'll listen for something quieter. A small idea. What if time isn't quite what we think it is? What if it slips sideways when we're not looking? What if light remembers things we've forgotten? This story will not hurry you. It will hum beside you like a distant star, always there but never demanding. If at any point you drift off, let it happen. That's part of the trick too. I'll be right here when you come back. Maybe you're curled on a couch, or under blankets, or walking through a neighborhood that feels softer at night. Wherever you are, this is where the hum begins. There's an old clock that sits at the top of a library no one visits after dusk. It's too heavy to move and too stubborn to throw away, so it stays in a corner where the ceiling arches like the inside of a shell. I was 13 when I first noticed it. The librarian told me it was broken but useful. She never explained how. I believed her because some people carry a certainty that folds your questions into silence. She had eyes that looked like they'd watched whole seasons slide off the calendar without blinking. I asked once what she meant by useful, and she only said sometimes you need to stand near something that doesn't pretend to move forward. I didn't understand then. I almost do now. Most evenings I climb the narrow stairs and find that clock. Its hands always stuck at 3:07. Sometimes I'd press my ear against its cold brass frame, not expecting a tick but something else, a murmur, maybe. And I heard it once. A hum like the soft vibration of air before thunder. I told myself it was the pipes. But the pipes had no reason to sound like a sigh that wanted me to listen. That winter I stayed late more than I should have. The librarian didn't mind, or pretended not to. She knew how to make a silence feel like permission. I'd watch the snow gather on the skylight above the clock. I'd imagine the flakes slowing down as they passed the glass. I wondered if they ever truly landed or if they just hovered there, caught between seconds the clock had forgotten how to count. Sometimes I'd read whatever book I'd carried up with me. Sometimes I'd just sit and think about how light travels from the past to remind us of what was. How the stars we wish on are mostly dead, but we make our wishes anyway. One night, I found a note slipped behind the glass face. Just a scrap folded twice. It said time is not a river. It is a trick of the light. I read it 3 times and tucked it into my pocket like a secret. I didn't tell the librarian. I didn't tell anyone. I liked believing the clock had told me itself. On my walk home, I kept looking back at the library windows. I half expected to see the clock shadow waving me on. That attic room I called mine was mostly books and blankets, and the shape of my own breath when the radiator gave up. I'd lie there listening to the wind slip under the eaves, thinking about how old air never really leaves a place. It just becomes part of the next breath. I wondered if time did the same. Maybe it never leaves either. Maybe every second is still here somewhere, folded in the walls, humming behind clocks that forget how to tick. In school, they taught us about light. How it takes 8 minutes to reach us from the sun. How the glow of distant stars is a message from years we'll never touch. They made it sound simple. Numbers, measurements, so many zeros to tame the wonder. But they didn't tell us what it feels like to stand in the dark and realize your shadow is stitched to a memory of light that may have died before you were born. That kind of lesson doesn't fit in a textbook. I started writing little questions in the margins of my notebooks. Not the kind with answers. More like invitations. Where does yesterday go when we stop needing it? Who taught the stars to keep shining for eyes that will never look up? Does the universe have a heartbeat, or is that just us pressing our ears against the dark? The librarian found my notebook once when I'd left it on the stairs. She didn't ask why I wrote those things. She only said, "Be careful. Some questions wake up when you write them down." Sometimes after closing, she'd let me sit by the window on the top floor where the city looked small enough to hold. She'd tell me stories I half believed, about a man who once stood so still he slipped into another century without moving his feet, about a comet that circled back every 100 years just to check if anyone remembered its name. I listened because I wanted them to be true. Even now I think maybe they were. The clock never moved its hands for me. But once, just once, I swear it moved something else. I was dozing against the radiator, half awake. I heard the hum again. Louder this time. Not a tick, not a bell. More like a pulse inside the walls. I opened my eyes, and the hands were different. Not pointing to 307 but 308. Just a minute stolen from nowhere. When I blinked they were back where they'd always been. The librarian said nothing when I told her. She only asked if I was sure. I wasn't. I still am. Years later when I moved away, I left the note behind. Folded it into a book I never returned. I thought maybe the next person would find it. Maybe they'd press their ear to the clock and wait for the hum. Maybe they'd ask the same questions. Maybe they'd understand that time doesn't always slip forward like a train on a track. Sometimes it curls back on itself like a dream you wake from only to find you're still dreaming. Now when I think of that library, I see the clock first. The frozen hands. The brass face blurred by fingerprints and dust. I see the librarian's eyes behind the glasses catching the last glow of sunset like a promise not yet spoken. I wonder if she's still there, dusting the shelves, listening for a hum that never quite fades. I wonder if the clock is still forgetting how to tick, or if it's waiting for someone new to press an ear close and hear the trick for themselves. And when the nights are too long, when the world feels like it's slipping past faster than I can hold, I close my eyes and listen. Somewhere under the noise of days and deadlines I hear it. That soft vibration reminding me that maybe time is not a river at all. Maybe it's light folding around corners we can't see. Maybe it's just waiting for us to notice how quietly it hums. I didn't plan to come back, but sometimes a thought turns into a small tug behind the ribs, and before you know it you're standing in the doorway again, brushing dust off your sleeves, pretending you're just passing through. The library felt the same the day I returned, a little older, not much wiser, with too many words clinging to the inside of my mouth, like they were afraid of the quiet. Outside the sky was pulling itself into evening the way it does when the sun wants to linger, but the horizon insists otherwise. I paused at the front desk to see if she was still there, and of course she was, the librarian with her hair pinned into the same tidy, not the same glasses perched on her nose, like a question she never needed to answer. She didn't ask where I'd been, she just nodded toward the stairs and said, "You might as well go on up, he's waiting for you." And I didn't think to ask who he was, because some things don't need to make sense until you're ready for them to. The steps creaked under my feet like they remembered each climb, my shoes softer now, more worn. When I reached the landing, the clock greeted me with its silent face, hands still stuck, as if to say nothing has changed, and yet everything has. I ran my fingertips along the glass smudge with years of breath and dust, and maybe a few forgotten wishes. For a moment, I thought about opening it up to see if the note was still inside, but my pockets were empty, and my courage was elsewhere. Instead, I sat down cross-legged on the floor, watching the last gold threads of daylight slide across the wooden boards. Somewhere below, a door closed gently, and the hush that followed felt like an invitation. It was the hum that found me first, a faint vibration like a cat purring in a dark hallway, not quite sound, more the memory of one. I rested my head against the wall, letting it seep into my bones, wondering if maybe it had been waiting this whole time, patient as dust. I thought about what it meant to wait, how light leaves a star and travels years and years just to slip through a crack in a window onto someone's face who never asked for it. How sometimes we see that light and call it a miracle when really it's just old news arriving late. I wanted to ask the clock if that's what it was, a messenger, not a keeper, if maybe it was showing me not what hour it was, but what hour it used to be, or might be again, if I stood still long enough. The hum grew warmer, or maybe that was just the radiator sighing awake, but it didn't matter, because in that moment I could almost feel the minutes bending around me, not rushing forward, not dragging back, just folding soft as sheets still warm from sleep. Downstairs, I heard the librarian's voice drifting up through the floorboards, a faint melody of words to another patron, maybe, or to no one at all, because she often spoke to the shelves as if the books liked the company. I closed my eyes and let her words blend with the hum, and for a heartbeat or a century, I couldn't tell which, I thought I understood something important, that time isn't so much a line or a loop, but a place you visit when you need to remember who you were before the days stacked themselves into worry. When I opened my eyes, the clock's hands hadn't moved, but there was a small feather resting on my knee, a pale wisp that must have drifted in through the cracked window, though I couldn't feel a breeze. I turned it over between my fingers, marveling at how something so slight could find its way here to this forgotten corner, perched beside a machine that forgot how to count. It felt like a message, though it didn't say anything clear, so I tucked it into my pocket where the old note used to live, and promised myself I'd keep it at least until I understood what it wanted from me. The hum faded then, or maybe my heartbeat drowned it out. I couldn't be sure, but I stood up and leaned closer to the clock, pressing my forehead to the glass until I could see my own reflection there, blurred by smudges and the faint outline of the stopped hands behind my eyes. I whispered to it, though I didn't expect an answer, something like "I'm still listening," just so it would know I hadn't forgotten how. When I turned to leave, the shadows had deepened, the library lights flickered on in quiet rows, making the stairwell look longer than it was. I paused at the top step, glancing back one more time to see if the clock might shift its hands, just for me, just enough to say good night, but it stayed, as it was steady, patient, unworried. The librarian met me at the bottom, her eyes kind but sharp, like she knew I'd heard something I wasn't ready to tell. She handed me a small wrapped parcel, no label, no note, just a soft bundle that fit in my palm. She said, "Take it with you, it might help you listen when the hum is too far away," and I wanted to ask what it was, but the way she turned back to her desk told me the question could wait until I was alone. Outside, the night had settled fully, now draping the street in a velvet hush. I tucked the parcel deep in my coat pocket, feeling its weight, or lack of it, more an idea than an object. I walked home slow, letting the streetlights carve shadows that flickered and stretched like thoughts that didn't want to settle. In my room, I placed the parcel on the desk unopened, a promise to myself to wait until I was ready, not because I feared what it held, but because sometimes you have to let a secret breathe before you unwrap it. I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling, tracing the shape of cracks like constellations, telling myself stories about stars that hummed just like clocks that forgot how to tick. Somewhere below, the radiator clanked a tired lullaby, and outside the wind carried a stray echo of the city's heartbeat, so faint it could have been mine. I let my eyelids drift closed, still feeling the feather in my pocket, still hearing the clock's soft promise that maybe time is only a trick we agree to believe until we're brave enough to listen for the hum instead. When morning came, it arrived soft and gray through the thin attic window, drifting over my blankets like a question I hadn't yet found words for. The small parcel still sat on the desk where I had left it untouched, though all night I had felt its presence just beyond the reach of sleep, like a quiet promise I wasn't sure I was ready to unwrap. I lay there for a long while, listening to the creaks of the house settling into itself, the slow stretch of wood and pipe, as if the building too was waking up reluctantly. Outside, the street was mostly empty save for a stray cat perched on the stone wall across the way, its tail curled neatly around its paws, as it watched the world decide whether it would rain. I turned the parcel over in my hands, its paper wrapping thin and slightly crinkled, as though it had been waiting much longer than a single night to be carried up these stairs and placed before me. My fingers hesitated at the knot of string, part of me wanting to tug it free, and part of me thinking maybe it was better not to know, at least not yet, because once you open a thing it can never be unopened, and I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever might spill out. But curiosity is a soft kind of gravity, and soon enough I found myself untying the knot, careful not to tear the paper more than I had to. Inside, nestled in a small bed of faded cloth, was a pocket watch, old but not so old that it looked fragile, the kind with a hinged cover, and an inscription etched along its edge so worn I had to tilt it toward the window to catch the faint light. I read the words once, then again, the letters almost disappearing into the tarnished metal. It said, "To be lost is to be here," and I turned it over, half expecting the hands inside to be frozen like the library clock, but when I pressed the latch and the cover sprang open, I saw they were moving, slow, steady, deliberate. I held it to my ear and waited for the tick, but what I heard instead was softer than a heartbeat, more like a whisper that slipped through the gears. Only when I really listened, a sound that felt familiar, though I could not say why. I closed it gently and placed it on the desk beside the scrap of wrapping paper, which now seemed less important than the small echo I felt humming along my pulse. I wondered if the librarian knew exactly what she had given me, or if she too was only passing along a question she did not know how to ask out loud. I carried the watch with me through the day, tucked deep in my pocket like a secret that warmed the fabric around it each time I pressed my palm to it, as though it were reminding me that even when I stopped to stand still, time might not be the only thing that moved. I walked through the city without much purpose, weaving between slow traffic and rain-slick sidewalks, watching strangers tuck their chins into scars as the drizzle fell in polite drifts that painted everything in shades of quiet silver. I thought about the hum behind the library clock, about the feather now pinned between pages of an old notebook on my bedside table, about how some things find their way to you only when you are too tired to chase them. By the time I reached the edge of the park, where the grass grew in soft patches, and the trees arched their wet branches toward each other like old friends whispering secrets, I felt the watch pulse once more against my leg, as if to say, "Pay attention, this is also part of it." I found a bench under the wide arms of an elm, and sat there while the drizzle softened to mist, and the city's distant hum folded itself into birdsong, and the hush of tires slipping over damp streets. I opened the watch again, not to check the hour, but just to listen for the whisper that lived inside its gears. I imagined it was telling me stories in a language I did not quite know, but almost remembered, the way you remember a dream halfway through breakfast only to lose it again before you find a pen. I thought of the librarian, her eyes reflecting the rows of books behind her, her voice always careful, never hurried, as if each word needed to be certain of its place before it left her tongue. I wondered if she sat behind that old desk now tracing the spines of books that never moved from their shelves, humming to herself in the same hush the clock offered me each night I chose to return. The rain returned in a soft curtain, so I slipped the watch back into my pocket and stood up, my coat damp at the shoulders, but my steps lighter somehow, guided by something I couldn't quite name, but didn't feel the need to resist. I made my way back through the streets, following the same cracks in the pavement, the same flicker of neon signs that had once felt cold and ordinary, but now seemed to pulse in time with a rhythm I was only beginning to hear. When I reached the library, the door was unlocked, as always, a promise tucked behind heavy wood that the place would never quite turn you away, no matter how long you had been gone. The librarian looked up from her ledger as I entered, her glasses slipping down her nose just enough to let her eyes catch mine, with a softness that said, "I know you opened it," but she said nothing, instead only gestured toward the stairs, where the clock waited, its brass face blurred by dust, and the thin fingers of sunlight that still found their way through high windows. I climbed the steps slower this time, feeling the watch in my pocket, counting not seconds, but something deeper, something I could almost taste at the back of my throat, like the first sip of tea before it cools. The clock did not greet me with any new trick, its hands stubbornly loyal to the moment they had chosen to hold, but when I pressed my ear to its side, I felt the hum again, stronger than before, as if the watch and the clock were two halves of the same word spoken in a dialect only silence could translate. I stayed there longer than I meant, to knees pressed to the cold floor, my breath fogging the glass, until I could not see my reflection, only the faint echo of hands that refused to move yet somehow kept pulling me forward. When I finally stood, the library below was quiet save for the faint shuffle of the librarian's footsteps, the smell of old paper and polished wood wrapping around me like a familiar blanket. I left the building without a word, the watch heavy in my coat, the hum tucked behind my ribs, and for the first time I did not feel as though I was chasing the trick of time, but rather that I was carrying it with me step by quiet step, as the sky turned from soft gray to the deep pink of an evening just beginning to remember the stars. When I woke the next morning, the watch was still there on the small table beside my bed, its cover closed, its whisper hidden for now, but I knew it was awake even when I was not. I lay still for a while, listening to the soft thrum of the pipes in the wall, the way the old building seemed to breathe alongside me, like a gentle reminder that everything creaks and shifts and hums if you listen long enough. I turned the watch over in my palm, feeling its weight, the cold metal slowly warming against my skin, as if it remembered the warmth of the pocket it had slept in all night. I pressed the latch and watched the hands sweep their slow arc, steady, precise, but carrying something more than seconds, something I could almost see flickering behind the tiny pane of glass, like the faint echo of a lantern carried through a hallway I had never walked down, but somehow knew by heart. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the street below my window wore its wetness like a secret, the puddles catching reflections of windows, clouds, a stray bird hopping along the curb pecking at something only it could see. I dressed slowly, layering warmth against the thin spring chill that always seemed to slip back in no matter how many times the calendar insisted winter was gone. Before I left, I tucked the watch into my pocket, the feather still pinned in the notebook, like a promise to come back to the question I had not yet dared to ask aloud. The library called to me again, the way an old friend does when you think you are done needing each other, but find yourself drifting back anyway. The streets were softer in the early light, shop shutters still closed except for a few that glowed with the promise of coffee and bread, and the small rituals that remind us to stay tethered to the hours we pretend to control. I stopped by a bakery, the bell above the door giving a single clear chime as I stepped inside, the smell of yeast and warmth wrapping itself around me in a way that made me think of childhood kitchens where time stretched like dough pulled thin and left to rise. The woman behind the counter offered me a roll wrapped in wax paper, and when I pressed a coin into her palm, she held it a moment too long, her eyes drifting to my pocket where the watch rested, hidden, but somehow not invisible. She didn't say a word, just nodded once, as if to tell me she too heard the hum, or maybe she was only being polite, the way people are when they sense you are carrying something delicate just beneath your ribs. I ate the roll as I walked, flakes of crust falling to the pavement, seeds for small birds and quiet questions. By the time I reached the library steps, the clouds had pulled apart, leaving shy beams of sun that made the stone shine like it had been polished overnight by patient, unseen hands. Inside, the hush greeted me, as always, like a soft exhale waiting to wrap itself around my shoulders. The librarian was not at her desk this time, and for a moment I wondered if she was even real, if maybe she only appeared when the building needed her to remind people like me that we were never quite alone among these shells. I climbed the stairs without asking permission, the watch pressed warm against my thigh, each step an echo of the hundreds I had taken before, though today they felt different, softer, somehow more certain. When I reached the clock, I did not sit immediately, but stood before it, studying the way the dust caught the light, how the frozen hand still pointed to that same quiet promise of an hour that might never come, or might always be waiting just behind the hum. I opened the watch and held it close, listening to the small whirl and click of its gears, the heartbeat that was not mine, but seemed to speak to it anyway. I pressed the watch gently against the glass of the old clock, and for a breath I felt the vibration spread between them like two singers finding the same note in the dark. I closed my eyes, and in that hush I heard something shift, not loud, not sharp, just the soft scrape of a gear that had not moved in years, deciding it might try again, if only for a moment. When I opened my eyes, the hands had not moved, or maybe they had, and I had not noticed, because sometimes change does not announce itself with trumpets, but with a sigh so soft you mistake it for your own. I stepped back and sat down cross-legged on the floor, the cold boards pressing against my legs through my coat, grounding me as the hum settled into my bones. I thought about how light bends when it travels, how stars appear fixed yet drift so slowly we believe their stillness more than their truth. I wondered if the clock was my star, if its frozen face was just a map to something that could not be charted on any calendar. The librarian's steps drifted up the stairwell, slow, deliberate, the same rhythm I had come to expect, though. When she appeared, she carried no books, no ledgers, just her steady gaze that seemed to weigh me and the clock and the watch all at once. She sat beside me without a word, her knees cracking, a quiet reminder that even those who keep secrets cannot outrun the gentle tug of age. Together we listened, the library breathing around us, the faint rustle of pages below, the creak of old, with the distant rattle of a bus beyond the window carrying strangers who would never know this moment existed at all. She turned her head to me, her voice a soft echo, as if it had to slip past the years before it reached my ears, and asked, "Do you know what you are listening for?" And I wanted to say yes, but the word caught behind my teeth, because maybe I did not know, not really, not yet. She nodded, as if I had answered anyway, and placed her hand on the clock's face, a gesture so gentle it felt like a blessing or a farewell. We sat that way for what could have been minutes, or the length of a single breath held just shy of letting go. When she rose, she left me there alone again, though not lonely, because the hum was still there, the watch still ticking soft and patient against my palm, a reminder that time might be a trick, but some tricks are worth believing if only because they make you listen a little closer to the quiet that holds the world together. I left the library as the sun began to sink behind the rooftops, painting the windows gold, and the bricks a kind of tender fire that made even the alleys feel like corridors in some forgotten palace. The city felt different as I walked home, not bigger or smaller, but stretched as if each step pressed gently against the seams of hours I had once thought unbreakable. In my room, the watch sat open on the desk beside the feather, still pinned like a promise that I would keep asking the questions that did not want answers but wanted to be heard just the same. I lay in the hush of my blankets, listening for the hum that The days that followed unfolded like pages of a book someone else had written long ago and left for me to find on a shelf that only appeared when I was quiet enough to see it. I carried the watch with me everywhere, not because I needed to know the time, but because it reminded me to listen not just with my ears, but with the small hush that lived just behind my ribs, where the hum liked to curl up when the world grew too loud. Some mornings I would wake before dawn and sit by the attic window, the glass cold against my forehead, as the first light slipped shyly between the rooftops, painting the dust motes gold like tiny drifting lanterns. I would hold the watch open in my palm and watch the second hand sweep its small perfect circles, knowing it did not care whether I was awake or dreaming, because for it there was no difference, only the steady hush of gears turning secrets into motion. I began to notice small things that might have always been there, but had never lingered long enough for me to greet them. A thin crack in the windowsill that widened and closed with the changing weather, like a mouth whispering yes and no to questions only it could hear. The faint way the floorboards sighed when I crossed the room, as if they too were listening for the hum. Even the radiator had its own rhythm, a slow warmth that rose and fell like breath, reminding me that nothing holds still even when it looks perfectly still. I visited the library less out of duty now, and more because the building felt like a second heartbeat, an echo of my own curiosity humming through the shelves and the quiet nooks where light pooled in gentle puddles. The librarian was always there somewhere, drifting like smoke between the stacks, her footsteps more a suggestion than a sound. Sometimes I would catch her watching me over the rim of her glasses, her eyes soft but edged with that same patient question, "Do you know what you are listening for yet?" And I would answer her without words, by sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of the old clock, letting the hum fold itself around my shoulders like an old shawl that smelled faintly of dust and sunlight. On one of those afternoons when the rain had stopped, but the smell of it still clung to the air, I found myself in a part of the library I did not remember ever noticing before, a narrow hallway that bent gently left and right, then seemed to breathe me out into a small room with a single window set high in the wall. The room was empty except for a wooden stool and an old telescope pointed at nothing in particular, its brass tube polished by years of careful hands. I did not know whose hands, but I felt the weight of them, the way you feel the warmth of a blanket long after the person who wrapped you in it is gone. I sat on the stool and peered through the telescope, expecting only the soft blur of brick and sky, but instead I saw a star, or what I thought was a star, a single pinprick of light flickering stubbornly in the pale afternoon, as if it had something urgent to say. I pressed my eye closer, adjusting the small brass knob until the point of light sharpened just enough to remind me of the watch's tiny face, hands spinning in circles too small for the world to see all at once. I imagined the star's light leaving its surface years before I was born, pushing through the cold folds of space, carrying its hush across distances so wide they broke my thoughts into soft pieces. Maybe the hum came from there too. I thought maybe every tick of the clock, every whisper of the watch, every shift of the librarian's quiet gaze was just the long echo of a star that refused to forget its own name. I stayed there until my neck stiffened and the window's square of daylight turned the color of old paper. When I finally stood, I felt something small and hard beneath my shoe, a coin maybe, but when I bent to pick it up, it was a button smooth and pale as bone, carved with a tiny spiral that felt warm against my palm, though it should have been cold. I slipped it into my pocket beside the watch and left the little room without closing the door behind me, as if leaving it open might invite someone else to find the star, or maybe just remind the hum to keep traveling forward. That night in my attic room, I placed the button on the desk beside the feather, and the watch, arranging them in a small line, like stepping stones across a pond I was not yet brave enough to cross. I lay on my bed, staring up at the slanted ceiling, tracing the lines where water stains bloomed like distant continents on an old map. I wondered if every stain, every crack, every draft of wind rattling the window was just another way for the hum to speak when I was too tired to listen. I drifted between sleep and the hush that sometimes pretended to be sleep, a soft place where the difference between dream and memory blurred like the horizon at dusk. I dreamed of the library, but in the dream it had no roof, just endless sky overhead, the shelves stretching out like ribs of a whale long buried beneath sand and time. The clock was there too, but its hands spun backward, unwinding hours into thin threads that caught the wind and tangled in my hair as I stood barefoot among the books, listening for the hum that had become the sound of my own breath. When I woke, the watch lay open beside me, ticking its soft tick that was not a tick. The feather quivered in the draught from the cracked window, and the button rested on my pillow as if it had something to say but preferred to keep its words folded inside its spiral. I held it between my fingers, feeling its warmth, remembering the star and the telescope and the quiet room where sunlight painted dust into gold. I wondered if the librarian knew about the little room, if she had placed the telescope there for me or for whoever came next, or if it had always been waiting for any pair of eyes curious enough to wonder what light does when we stop watching. I rose from bed and pressed my ear to the wall, listening to the faint hum of pipes, and old with the secret song of a house that has stood too long to care about calendars. Somewhere beneath that hush, I thought I heard the echo of the clock, the gentle sweep of the watch, the distant memory of a star's flicker folded into the heartbeat that carried me from sleep into morning again. I did not know what any of it meant, not yet, but I felt the question settling deeper, threading its soft roots into the part of me that did not want an answer, only the promise that the hum would keep humming, the trick would keep unfolding, and I would keep listening until the hush told me it was time to hear more. The morning slid in quietly, as if it were trying not to wake the floorboards, or the old radiator, or the watch that rested open on my desk, whispering its tiny hush into the empty room. I sat up slowly, feeling the shape of sleep still clinging to my shoulders like a shawl I had forgotten to shrug off. The button was still there where I had left it beside the feather, and the notebook whose pages now curled gently at the edges from the damp that always found its way in through the thin attic walls. I traced a fingertip along the spiral etched into the button, half expecting it to spin under my touch like a tiny clock of its own, marking not seconds, but questions that had no place on any calendar. Outside, the street was waking too, with the hush of tires over damp pavement and the distant bark of a dog who sounded surprised to hear his own voice in the soft gray light. I stood and opened the window just enough to let the morning air slip in, carrying with it the smell of rain, and somewhere far off the faint sweetness of bread rising behind bakery doors. I liked that smell, how it reminded me that some things need darkness and warmth and patience before they become what they are meant to be. I slipped the watch into my pocket, the button beside it, the feather tucked safe between the pages of my notebook, like a quiet promise not to forget the question it carried. I made my way down the narrow stairs, careful not to wake the neighbors, though I knew the creak of my footsteps had long become part of the building's heartbeat, an old song the walls knew by heart. The city felt softer than usual as I stepped into it, the clouds drifting overhead like slow ships that had forgotten where they were sailing. I did not know exactly where I was going, but my feet seemed to know turning corners I might have passed 100 times before, but which now looked different, softer at the edges, as if they too were listening for the hum. I found myself at the library steps sooner than I expected, the stone still damp from the night's rain, the heavy door leaning slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for me to slip through. Inside, the hush wrapped itself around me at once, the smell of old paper and polished wood, and something else I could never name, but always recognized, a faint sweetness, like dust warmed by sunlight, that had not yet found its way through the high windows. I did not see the librarian at first, but I felt her presence the way you feel the hush inside a church or a hollow tree, or any place that holds stories too old to tell in daylight. I climbed the stairs toward the clock, my hand brushing the banister worn smooth by years of patient palms. The clock greeted me the same way it always did, silent, stubborn, its brass face soft with dust, its hands frozen at that hour that seemed less like a moment and more like a door that would open only when you stopped trying to push it. I sat cross-legged on the floor and rested my back against the cool wall, the watch warm in my pocket like a small heartbeat I had borrowed for a while. I closed my eyes and listened for the hum that never came exactly when I wanted it, but always when I was quiet enough to let it find me. Somewhere below I heard the librarian's voice drifting up through the hush, a soft hum of words I could not make out, but did not need to understand to know they were true. I opened my eyes and took the button from my pocket, turning it over and over in my palm, its spiral catching the light that now slipped through the tall window in thin, cautious threads. I held it against the clock's glass, pressing gently, as if I could coax the frozen hands to feel its warmth. Nothing moved, but the hush deepened until I could almost taste it on my tongue, like the bitter edge of tea that has sat too long cooling in its cup. I slipped the button back into my pocket and stood brushing dust from my coat, feeling older and younger all at once, the way you do when you realize you have been carrying something precious for longer than you knew. The librarian was waiting at the foot of the stairs when I descended, her glasses perched at the tip of her nose, her hands folded loosely, as if she had been expecting me all along. She did not ask where I had been or what I had found. She only tilted her head slightly and said, "The quietest questions are the ones that echo the longest," and I nodded because I felt the truth of it settle somewhere deep behind my ribs, where the hum liked to rest when I forgot to listen. She gestured toward a narrow corridor I had never noticed before, half hidden behind a shelf of dictionaries whose spines were cracked and faded like old smiles. I stepped into the corridor, feeling the hush shift around me the way air moves when you slip into a room where someone has just been thinking deeply. At the end of the corridor was a door painted the soft green of sea glass, worn smooth by tide and time. I pressed my palm against it and felt the faint warmth of sunlight on the other side, though I knew the door did not open to the outside world, at least not the one with streets and birds and the smell of fresh bread drifting through thin morning light. I turned the knob and stepped through into a small circular room lined with shelves that held not books, but jars, tiny glass jars, each filled with what looked like air, but felt heavier than any word I could find. In the center of the room was a small wooden table, and on it rested another clock smaller than the one upstairs, its face bare of numbers, its hands missing entirely, as if it had never learned how to pretend to count. I stepped closer, and saw that the glass of its face was cracked, a thin line running from top to bottom, like a hairline fracture in a bone that never quite healed. Beside it lay another note folded twice, just like the one I had found behind the old clock's glass so long ago. I unfolded it slowly, holding my breath, as if the hush needed space to lean closer and read over my shoulder. The note said, "Time is the hush between two questions," and I read it again and again until the words felt like they belonged not to the paper, but to my own bones. I placed the note back on the table and sat on the floor beside it, cross-legged, my knees pressed to the cold stone, the watch ticking softly in my pocket, the button warm against my leg, the hum rising like a small tide beneath my skin. I closed my eyes and let the hush fill the room, the jars lining the shelves breathing gently around me, each one holding a sigh or a whisper or a question that had slipped loose and needed a place to wait. I did not know how long I sat there, knees aching, back stiff, the faint smell of old wood and something sweet like dust and sunlight wrapped around me like a blanket I could not see. When I finally rose, I felt taller. The next morning, I woke with the shape of the green door still pressed behind my eyes, like a soft afterimage that refused to slip away with the fading dream. I lay there under the weight of blankets that smelled faintly of old books and night air, the watch ticking somewhere near my ribs where it had fallen, when I drifted off, too tired to place it gently back on the desk. I reached for it without opening my eyes, feeling its smooth weight in my palm, the way it seemed to breathe a little warmth into my skin, as if to say, "You are still here, and so am I." I did not rush to dress or to slip down the narrow stairs. Instead, I let the hush of the morning seep through the thin attic walls, carrying with it the distant hush of traffic, the drip of last night's rain from the gutter outside, and the quiet murmur of my own breath counting out a rhythm that had nothing to do with minutes or hours. I thought of the jars on the shelves in that small round room, how they had seemed to hold not air, but a hush too small to name, too big to forget. I wondered if the librarian knew what each jar held, if she could listen to them, the way she listened to books or clocks, or the questions she never asked aloud. I wondered if I could learn that too. When I rose and dressed, and stepped out into the soft bruise of early light, the city felt half asleep, the sidewalks littered with last night's stray leaves, and the fresh footprints of early risers who had places to be that did not ask them to listen too closely to the quiet between footfalls. I walked slower than I needed to pass shuttered shops and windows that blinked back my reflection in thin glass rippling with condensation. I paused at the bakery, not to buy anything but to breathe in the warmth that drifted out as a young woman carried a tray of rolls to the front window, her eyes soft with sleep, or maybe just the hush that rises in kitchens before dawn, when the only thing you can hear is the steady whisper of dough rising. She caught my eye, and for a moment I thought she might say something, but instead she only nodded, as if she could see the watch ticking in my pocket, the button warm against my palm, the hush waiting just behind my teeth for me to remember how to hold it without speaking. I left the bakery and turned down the street that led to the library, though my feet hesitated at the corner, where the streetlight flickered once, twice, then settled into a steady glow. I thought of the green door, the cracked clock, the note that said time is the hush between two questions, and wondered if maybe the streetlight was its own kind of hush, a pause in the electric heartbeat of the city, reminding me to stand still just long enough to remember the feeling of waiting without wanting. The library greeted me with the same soft hush that always curled around my shoulders when I stepped inside, the smell of old paper and polished wood, and something else that might have been the faint trace of the librarian's perfume, though I had never seen her wear any. She was there behind her desk, her eyes lifted just enough to catch mine over the rim of her glasses before she lowered them again to whatever ledger she was tending, like a garden of half-forgotten words. I wanted to ask her about the jars, the cracked clock, the note, but instead I only let my gaze rest on her for a heartbeat longer than was polite, until she looked up again and tilted her head, just so the way she did when she wanted to remind me that some questions are answered not with words, but with footsteps. So I climbed the stairs, my hand brushing the banister smooth with the memory of other hands, and found my way not to the clock this time, but to the narrow corridor hidden behind the shelf of old dictionaries, whose cracked spines whispered soft stories in languages I did not know, but somehow trusted. The green door waited for me, the paint chipped at the edges where other curious fingertips had pressed against it, wondering if what lay beyond was worth the hush it asked in return. I stepped through into the round room, and felt the same soft weight of quiet settle around my shoulders, the shelves of jars breathing their small sighs into the stillness, the cracked clock on the table looking back at me with its empty face that somehow did not feel empty at all. I sat on the floor beside it, cross-legged, my knees pressed to the cold stone, the watch warm in my pocket, the button cradled in my palm, like a question I was almost brave enough to ask. I placed the button on the table beside the cracked clock and listened the way you listen when you know the world is about to say something it has been holding back for years. For a long while there was nothing, only the slow hush of my own breath, the faint whisper of the watch, the jars lining the shelves holding their sighs, so gently I almost believed I could hear them thinking. Then the cracked clock gave a soft click, not a tick, but something older, deeper, a click that felt like a door inside me shifting open by half an inch. I did not move, did not breathe more than I had to. Instead, I watched the crack in the glass widen just enough to catch the thin spill of light from the high window and scatter it across the room in small trembling patterns that looked for all the world like starlight caught in a jar. I thought of the telescope in the hidden room, how the star I had seen through its brass I had seemed to pulse with a hush that matched the hum of the old clock upstairs, the whisper of the watch in my pocket, the soft gravity of the button now resting on the cold wood beside this new quiet machine. I did not know how long I sat there, but when I finally rose, my knees stiff and my breath shallow, the cracked clock was quiet again, the light had shifted, the jars seemed to hum a little softer, as if they too had heard what they needed, and now only asked to be left to their hush. I picked up the button, warm, now warmer than it should have been, as if it had soaked up the quiet, and carried it back to me like a small promise pressed into my palm. I slipped it into my pocket beside the watch, feeling their weight together, steady and soft, a heartbeat that did not count seconds, but only reminded me to listen. When I stepped back into the corridor, the librarian was there waiting, though she had made no sound to announce herself, her eyes soft behind her glasses, the corner of her mouth turned up just enough to let me know she had heard too, even if she would never say what she heard. She reached out and touched my shoulder, a gesture so light I wondered if I imagined it. Then she turned and drifted back toward her desk, her steps as quiet as the jars that lined the round room, her hush as patient as the cracked clock that waited for whoever would come next to press their ear to its broken face. When I woke the next morning, the light through the attic window felt different, softer somehow, as if it were sifting through another layer of air or memory before it found its way to my eyes. I lay there for a while, feeling the shape of the watch against my ribs where it had come to rest again during the night, its tiny hum a steady companion that seemed to breathe with me in the hush that always comes just before you decide to move. The button lay on the bedside table where I had left it warm now, even though the room held a lingering chill from the rain that had fallen most of the night, tapping its soft secrets against the window glass. I turned it over and my fingers tracing the spiral carved into its pale surface, wondering if it had always been this warm, or if it was only my own hush folded into it through every quiet moment I had spent pressing it to the clock or slipping it into my pocket, as if it might teach me how to hold still without freezing. The street outside was awake but gently, so the soft growl of distant cars, the murmur of a neighbor's door closing, the faint call of a bird brave enough to believe spring was finally here for good. I rose and dressed slowly, pulling my coat around me even though the air did not bite as sharply as it had days before, the watch slipping easily into its usual place where my palm could find it without thinking. I tucked the button beside it, and for a moment rested my hand over both, feeling their shared warm pulse against my skin like a heartbeat I could carry without ever needing to measure it. I stepped out into the street, letting the door click softly behind me, the building sighing, as if it too had decided to stretch a little more into the day. I did not tell my feet where to go, but they knew, carrying me through familiar corners, where the sidewalk buckled around the roots of old trees, and the windows of shuttered shops blinked back the soft silver light of morning. The bakery's door was propped open for the first time in weeks, letting the warmth spill out and dance with the cool breeze, and I paused there long enough to breathe in the sweetness of bread rising, the promise of coffee that smelled like a memory of comfort from a house I might have lived in once, though I could not say when. The young woman behind the counter caught my eye again, and this time she spoke, her voice as gentle as the dough she kneaded every morning. She asked me if I had found what I was looking for, and I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because her question felt like a mirror to the hush I had been carrying all this time. I told her not yet, and she only smiled, that small knowing smile of someone who understands that sometimes the finding is not in the answer, but in the asking itself. I thanked her, though I bought nothing, and stepped back out into the street, letting the warmth of her question follow me down the block and around the corner until the library rose before me again, its old stone walls soft with the last breath of night that still clung to the shadowed side of the building. I pushed through the heavy door, feeling the hush greet me at once the way it always did, wrapping itself around my shoulders and settling into the space between my ribs, where the hum liked to rest when I stood still long enough to listen. The librarian was not behind her desk this time, though I felt her there somewhere among the shelves, her presence stitched into the soft rustle of pages being turned, into the faint sigh of a book finding its place again on a high dusty shelf. I did not look for her. Instead, I let my steps carry me past the desk and up the stairs, my hand brushing the smooth banister worn by the memory of all the palms that had found it before mine. The old clock waited for me at the top, its brass face catching the weak sunlight that filtered through the high window, its hand still frozen at that same impossible hour that by now felt less like a mistake and more like a quiet promise kept only for me. I stood before it for a long moment, feeling the watch warm in my pocket, the button pressed gently into my palm, the hush leaning close enough that I thought I might hear the faint click of gears too stubborn to turn. I pressed the button against the glass just as I had before, half hoping the hands might tremble just enough to let me know they remembered me, but they stayed still, the glass cool beneath my fingers, the hum steady in my chest, as if to remind me that the clock's trick was never about moving, but about listening. I turned and slipped down the narrow corridor behind the shelf of old dictionaries, the green door waiting at the end like an old friend who never needed to knock. The round room beyond was exactly as I had left it, the jars lining the walls breathing their faint sighs, the cracked clock on the table waiting with its empty face turned just so toward the high window where the light fell in a gentle spill across the stone floor. I sat again on the cold ground, my knees tucked close, my breath slow enough to match the steady whisper of the watch, the soft warmth of the button resting in my open palm. I did not try to speak to the cracked clock this time, nor did I press the button to its glass. Instead, I closed my eyes and let the hush fill the room, the way water fills the smallest cracks in stone, slowly, patiently, without force or hurry. Somewhere in that hush, I thought I could hear the jars breathing, not with sound, but with memory, each one holding the hush of a question asked and left unanswered, not because the answer was hidden, but because sometimes the asking was enough to keep the hum alive. I wondered who had first placed the cracked clock on the table, who had lined the shelves with jars, who had written the note that now lay folded in my coat pocket, a soft slip of paper reminding me that time is the hush between two questions. I wondered if the librarian had always been here, or if she too had once stood in this circle of quiet, holding her breath, waiting for the hum to slip under her skin and remind her that some clocks do not tick because they have no need for seconds. When I opened my eyes, the light through the high window had shifted just enough to catch the edge of one jar, a small one near the top shelf, its glass catching the sun and spilling it back into the room in a thin line that found my hand and the button, and for a moment I thought I could see the spiral carved into its pale surface, glowing softly, as if it were pulling the hush into itself, winding it tight, so I could carry it out into the world without losing the question it held. I rose slowly, my knees stiff, the cold stone clinging to the shape of my legs. Long after I stood, the watch humming its steady truth against my side, the button now warm enough that it felt like a. The street felt brighter that day, not because the sun was stronger or the clouds had disappeared, but because something in me seemed to tilt just enough to let the light in where before it might have slipped past unnoticed. I walked with my hand in my pocket, fingers curled around the button, and the watch feeling their warmth press back into my skin as if they were small pieces of the hush folded into shapes I could carry out here among the ordinary noise of car engines and voices, and the soft percussion of footsteps passing through puddles left by the night's half-forgotten rain. I did not head straight home, though my feet knew the way without asking. I let them wander through streets I had walked so many times they should have felt worn out by my passing, but instead, they seemed new, softened at the edges by the simple fact that I was listening in a way I had not done before. I passed the small shop that sold dusty postcards of places I suspected no one ever really visited, and a stray cat sat beneath the display window, its fur the same color as the morning sky, that pale, uncommitted blue that promises rain and sun in the same breath. The cat watched me with eyes half closed, a slow blink that felt almost like an echo of the hush tucked behind my ribs, and for a moment I wished I could ask it what it knew of clocks that forget how to tick, or buttons that remember warmth long after the hand lets go. It flicked its tail once, as if to say some secrets stay soft only when you leave them alone, so I kept walking. I found myself at the edge of the park, the one with the old iron gate that squealed a greeting whenever someone nudged it open, and I slipped through, letting it hum its rusted song behind me. The grass was damp and green, the path soft underfoot, where last night's rain had settled into small pools that caught the sky in trembling pieces. I found a bench beneath the arms of an old oak tree, its branches just beginning to wake with the first shy buds of spring, and I sat there, letting the hush find its place between my heartbeat and the distant rush of traffic that never really leaves, no matter how far you wander from the roads that feed it. I pulled the watch from my pocket and held it open in my palm, the tiny hands sweeping their endless circle, not with urgency, but with a kind of patient delight, as if they knew there was nowhere else to be except here inside this soft moment that did not ask for measurement or explanation. I turned the button over beside it, feeling the spiral under my thumb warm and familiar now, like the edge of a well-loved page that always opens to the same line, no matter how many times you close the book. I wondered if the hush had found its shape in these small things, or if these small things had simply reminded me that the hush had always been waiting in the spaces between words and footsteps, and the soft hush of breath in the middle of the night, when you wake for no reason and listen for something you do not have a name for. A couple passed by pushing a stroller, the baby inside wrapped tight in blankets, its tiny fist curled beneath its chin, and I watched them drift past, their quiet conversation carried away on the breeze before I could catch any of it. But I liked not knowing what they said. It was enough to know they were speaking softly to each other, as if they too were careful not to disturb the hush that hangs so easily in the air when you walk through a park before the city has fully shaken the sleep from its shoulders. I closed the watch and slipped it back into my pocket, with the button pressing my palm flat against them for a moment before I let my hands rest in my lap. The oak above me creaked gently in the breeze, branches leaning close, then sighing back as if they were old friends leaning in to share a secret, then remembering it was better left unspoken. I thought of the librarian and the jars lining that hidden round room, each holding its hush so carefully that even when the door closed behind me I could feel them breathing through the walls, the way you feel the heartbeat of someone pressed close to your back when the night outside feels too wide to hold alone. I wondered if she was there now, tending her ledgers, moving among the shelves, her footsteps stitching quiet into the threads of other people's questions, so soft no one ever noticed how they trailed behind her like silk unwinding in the dark. Maybe she would find the green door open again later today. Maybe she would pause at the cracked clock, run her finger along its split face, and listen for the hush that lives in the broken things we choose to keep near us. I did not know, and for once I did not need to. The cloud shifted above the oak tree, the sun slipping through in thin golden threads that danced along the damp grass, and the wooden slats of the bench warming my shoulder just enough to remind me that sometimes the world says hush with light, not silence, that sometimes the softest truths arrive dressed in warmth you did not know you were waiting for. I leaned back, closing my eyes, letting the hush slip deeper into my chest, where it tangled with the hum of the watch, the warmth of the button, the memory of the cracked clock, and the jars breathing softly in their circle of stone and shadow. For a moment, I felt the quiet so fully that I almost believed I could hear the faint whir of the earth spinning beneath me, not fast, not slow, just steady, a reminder that time does not always tick in seconds, but sometimes in the hush between one breath and the next. When I opened my eyes, the sun had moved the shadows, stretching long fingers across the path, as if to point me gently back toward the street where people would be gathering now, pulling open shop doors, rattling keys and locks, speaking their small good mornings that meant more than they sounded like. I rose from the bench and slipped my hands back into my pockets, the button warm against my palm, the watch steady and sure pressed to my hip like a promise I did not have to name. I left the park through the squealing iron gate, its song softer now behind me, as if it too had learned how to carry the hush inside its rusted hinges. I let my feet carry me home, though I paused once before I reached my street, standing at the corner where the buildings leaned close enough to catch the last of the sun along their brick shoulders. I thought of the attic room waiting for me, the way the floorboards would sigh when I crossed them, the way the radiator would click and hum as the pipes remembered warmth. I thought of the notebook with the feather still tucked inside its pages, the question still waiting where I had left it, half written and unfinished, because sometimes questions need time to unfold, like the slow turn of the earth under a tree that remembers every winter and every spring without needing to measure the days in between. When I reached my door, I paused one last time, my hand resting on the knob, feeling the pulse of the watch through the fabric of my coat, the hush steady behind my ribs, reminding me that I did not need to open it yet, that the trick was not in stepping inside, but in knowing that the hush would follow me whether I did or not, and that it. When I stepped inside the attic room, the hush slipped in with me, as if it had been waiting on the other side of the door, leaning against the chipped wood, while I wandered through the streets tracing slow circles around my own questions. I let the door click shut behind me and stood for a moment in the soft dim, where the daylight pressed through the small window in a thin quiet line, dust drifting through it like tiny seeds waiting for somewhere to land. I shrugged off my coat and draped it across the chair by the desk, the watch still warm in the pocket, the button tucked safe beside it, carrying the soft echo of my pulse into the hush that filled the room. I sat at the desk and opened the notebook where the feather still rested between the pages, its pale edge catching the narrow light like a whisper I had forgotten how to hear. I ran my fingertip along the spine of the book, feeling the paper give a little beneath the weight of my touch, as if it knew I would not write just yet, that the words needed to settle first like dust on a shelf untouched by wind. The radiator clicked to life behind me, the faint warmth spreading through the floorboards, the pipes humming the way they always did when the house remembered the shape of warmth after too many cold nights. I closed my eyes and leaned back, listening to the hush move through the walls, through the soft stretch of the wooden beams above me, through the space between the slow rhythm of my breath and the steady hush of the watch ticking patiently against the coat pocket that still held it. I thought of the cracked clock and the jars lined up like tiny lungs in that round room behind the green door, the way they had seemed to breathe with me when I sat there, knees pressed to the cold stone, feeling the hush slip into the soft folds between my ribs. I wondered if each jar held a piece of someone's question left behind for the hush to carry when the world grew too loud to hold it alone. I wondered if the librarian ever opened them when the library was empty, if she stood there in the hush of that hidden room and lifted the lids just enough to let the questions breathe again, to let the silence find its shape around them like water around a stone. Outside the window, the sky shifted its color from soft gray to the pale, uncertain blue that comes when the day is neither morning nor afternoon, but something between the two, a pause in the turning that you can miss if you do not stand still and look. I watched it for a while, the rooftops leaning into each other, the chimneys exhaling small ghosts of warmth that drifted away before they could remember where they came from. I thought of the star I had seen through the brass eye of the old telescope hidden in the small room behind the shelves, how its light had traveled so far only to land in the dark center of my eye for a moment before drifting on. Maybe the hush was like that too, never staying too long in any one place, always folding itself back into the spaces between heartbeats, between pages, between the soft creak of footsteps on old floorboards. I reached into my coat and took out the watch, placing it open on the desk, its hands sweeping their careful arcs across the tiny face that never asked me to measure anything at all, only to notice how easily time softened when I stopped pretending to catch it. Beside it I placed the button, turning it so the spiral faced up, catching the thin light and bending it back toward my eyes in a way that made me think of the curve of the cracked clock's glass, the line that split it but did not break it. I thought of how the librarian's eyes had held mine just long enough to remind me that some questions do not need answers, only the soft courage to keep asking them again and again until the asking becomes a kind of hush all its own. I ran my thumb over the spiral, feeling the warmth that seemed to live there now, pressed into the small grooves like a secret the hush had chosen to keep. The radiator hissed and clicked, and the pipes knocked in quiet conversation with each other, telling stories I could almost understand if I pressed my ear to the wall and listened with the same part of me that heard the hum behind the clock in the library. I thought about going back tonight, slipping through the door at closing when the last footsteps had faded down the marble steps and the lamps hummed to themselves in the quiet dark, but I stayed where I was, letting the idea settle like another feather dropped into the hush that now curled itself around my shoulders like a soft cloak. I lifted the feather from the notebook and held it to the window, the faint light turning it into a pale flicker against the glass, a small, fragile thing that somehow felt heavier than my own breath. I wondered if it had fallen from a bird passing above the skylight, or drifted through a crack in the library roof, or if maybe it had always been here waiting for me to find it when I needed to remember how to listen to the hush that lives inside every pause, every held breath, every step not taken. I placed it beside the watch and the button, and watched the three of them together, their shapes, so small, on the broad empty desk, yet filling the space with a quiet weight that pulled the hush deeper into the room. I let my fingers rest beside them, not touching now, just close enough to feel the warmth that seemed to pass between them, the way the hush passed between my ribs and the walls, and the slow, steady hum of the pipes. Outside a bird called once, twice, then fell silent, as if it too had remembered the trick of the hush, the way it slips under the noise, and waits there soft and patient and steady. I wondered if the librarian would find another note one day tucked behind the clock, or beneath the cracked glass of the small round timepiece in that hidden room, a note that said the hush is the trick, and the trick is the listening, and maybe she would smile, that quiet smile of hers, and tuck it into a book that no one would check out, just so it could wait there for the next person who needed to find it. The watch ticked on, the feathers shivered in the draft that slipped through the window frame, the button warmed beneath my hand, and I felt the hush hold all of it at once, folding me into the trick I no longer needed to name. I did not move to write, did not stand to light the lamp, though the sky outside softened again, leaning toward dusk, the rooftops growing darker in their corners as the day let go of its last light and settled into the same patient hush that waited behind the hum of the clock, the breath of the pipes, the slow, careful heartbeat of my own chest pressed close to the small warmth I carried like a secret I would never need to say out loud. By the time the dusk slipped all the way into night, the attic room felt more like the inside of a pocket than a place with walls and corners and floors that creaked under every shift of weight. I sat with my back against the cold radiator, listening to it tick and sigh, as if it too were trying to remember how to keep warm after so many years of giving away its heat to quiet rooms and sleepless tenants. The watch lay open on the floor beside me, its small voice folding itself into the hush that wrapped the rafters, and the window pane where my breath had left a faint ghost of warmth that faded as soon as it found the glass. The button sat in my palm, turning slowly under my thumb, its spiral catching the light from the street lamp that flickered through the narrow crack in the curtain, and making it dance just enough to remind me that some things only reveal themselves when you think you've grown too tired to look again. I wanted to believe the hush lived only in the library, in the cracked clock, and the jars lined up like small patient lungs, but sitting there with my knees drawn close, I knew it had always lived here too, in this thin-walled room at the top of an old house that creaked like a ship when the wind pressed against its bones. I let my head rest back against the radiator and closed my eyes, the hum of the pipes and the faint steady tick of the watch slipping together until they were one sound, a sound I carried inside me even when I thought I'd left it behind, on marble steps and under arched ceilings filled with books no one read anymore. I thought of the librarian as I drifted, half awake, half listening, her careful steps in the dark, her hand brushing the cracked glass of the clock, her fingers tracing the rim of the jar, as if she could hear the hush echoing back through her skin into her bones where maybe it had always belonged. I wondered what she heard when she stood alone in that round room, if the hush spoke her name the way it sometimes pressed against my ribs when I was too still for sleep, but not yet brave enough to stand up and pace the floor like someone waiting for a door to open in a wall that wasn't really there. Outside, a car passed slowly, its tires whispering against the wet street, the sound folding itself under the attic window, and then drifting away as if it had never meant to stay. I opened my eyes to the faint shape of the feather where it lay on the desk, its pale edge glowing in the thin spill of lamplight from the street below. I thought about the bird. It must have fallen from the shape of wings slicing through a sky that paid no mind to clocks or notebooks or questions written in the margins of half-filled pages. Maybe the bird had never noticed the feather slip free. Maybe it had drifted through a crack in the library roof and settled into my pocket when I wasn't looking. The hush sang, "Here, this is yours now. Carry it carefully. And remember the weight of something that almost weighs nothing at all." I pushed myself up from the radiator and crossed the room to the desk, the floorboards murmuring under my bare feet, a soft creak that felt like an old friend reminding me I was not alone, even here in this pocket of stillness. I sat down and opened the notebook, the feather resting between the pages like a bookmark for a question I had not finished writing. The ink on the page was faint where my pen had hesitated, drifting off into a curve that ended mid-thought, a line waiting for breath. I pressed my fingertip to it, feeling the indent left by the pen's tip, a small valley where the hush had settled when I stepped away to listen for it elsewhere. I thought about writing then, but the hush pressed back into my shoulders, soft and patient, as if to say, "Not yet. You don't have to name it tonight. Just feel it breathing with you, and know that it is enough." So I closed the notebook again and let my hands rest on its cover, feeling the cool spine under my palms, the small warmth of the button still tucked in my other hand, pressing its spiral into my skin as if it were trying to leave its shape there for me to find later, when the hush slipped away behind the noise of day. I stood and crossed back to the window, pushing the curtain aside, just enough to see the street below where the lamps made small islands of gold along the wet pavement. A stray dog paused in the pool of light, nose lifted as if listening for something only it could hear before it trotted off into the dark, leaving the hush to settle back into the puddles it had disturbed. I leaned my forehead to the glass cold against my skin and let my breath fog the window again, a small reminder that I was here, that my heartbeat hummed through the watch and the radiator and the cracked paint on the walls that held this room together, one slow sigh at a time. I wondered if the hush would ever slip away from me, if one morning I would wake and find the watch silent, the button cool, the feather gone from its place between the pages. But the thought did not scare me the way it once might have. I knew now the hush did not belong to the clock or the jar or the green door hidden behind shelves of books that had forgotten their own titles. It lived in the quiet between steps, in the soft space under the ribs where breath waited to become words, in the small shift of shadows across the ceiling as headlights drifted past and left me alone again with the soft company of my own questions. I pressed the button against the window for a moment, feeling its warmth bleed into the cold glass, and then I slipped it into my pocket beside the watch, letting them settle together like two pieces of the same puzzle that did not need solving, only holding. I turned away from the window and slipped back onto the floor near the radiator, pulling my knees to my chest and closing my eyes, the hush curling around my ears and under my skin, the pipes humming, the watch ticking, the floor creaking now and then as if the house were reminding itself how to breathe. I stayed like that until my head grew heavy and my thoughts drifted sideways into dreams of wings and glass and corridors lined with books that never needed to be opened because the stories they held were already written in the soft, quiet place behind my eyes where the hush hummed itself into the shape of sleep. When I woke hours later, the watch still whispered in my pocket, the button warm against my palm, the radiator a faint memory of heat against my back, and I knew without needing to see the clock or the jars or the feather that the hush had stayed with me not as a secret, but as a promise to keep listening every time I thought I had run out of questions to ask. I woke to the hush still pressed against my ribs, like a second heartbeat, softer than my own yet steadier than anything I could name. The attic room was cold with the kind of chill that seeps in through old wood and cracked plaster, and settles along the floorboards waiting for footsteps to stir it back into the air. I sat up slowly, feeling the stiffness in my shoulders, the weight of sleep tugging at the edges of my thoughts, but underneath it all the steady presence of the watch in my pocket, the button warm beside it, the feather still resting where I had left it, half tucked into the pages of my notebook, as if it too had drifted off into whatever dreams come to small things that wait in the dark for someone to remember they are there. I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling the quiet hum there, not the frantic thud of fear or hurry, but something patient, like the deep breath you take before stepping into the first light of morning, when the street outside is still folded in mist, and the world has not yet remembered how to be loud. I slipped my feet into worn slippers, the floor cold and splintered beneath the thin soles, reminding me that some parts of this place would never quite warm, no matter how many nights I asked the radiator to breathe heat into the corners. I moved to the window and lifted the curtain just enough to see the roofline stitched together in shadow, and pale dawn, the sky above them a soft quilt of drifting clouds that promised more rain, or maybe nothing at all, just a day that would unfold like any other if I let it. I thought about the library, and the clock, and the green door behind the shelves, how the hush there had once seemed so separate from the hush I carried now pressed beneath my ribs, like a coin I could never spend. I wondered if the librarian was there this early, walking the aisles with her quiet steps, brushing her fingertips along the spines of books that had not been touched in years, listening to the jars breathe in the hidden room, waiting for the hum to tell her the next question to keep safe. I wondered if she ever found notes I had not left yet, scribbled half awake and tucked between pages, where someone else might find them one day and feel the hush settle into their chest the way it had settled into mine. I dressed slowly, layering warmth against the morning's chill, the watch slipping back into my pocket with a weight that felt more like reassurance than burden, the button pressing its small spiral into my palm each time I brushed my hand against the fabric. I paused before the door, looking back at the desk where the notebook lay closed, feather peeking out like a promise I had not yet made. I left it there, knowing it would wait without complaint, the way the cracked clock waited, the way the jars lined the round room and breathed in the hush I could not see, but always felt when I stepped into that soft circle of stone and shadow. The stairs creaked under my feet as I stepped down into the hallway, each groan of what a reminder that this building knew how to listen to, how to hold stories and footsteps, and the soft rustle of coats being pulled on before the door opened to the street beyond. Outside the air was sharp enough to wake me fully, the chill biting at the edges of my coat, the sky above split into thin strips of dawn and drifting cloud. I walked without hurry, letting my feet find the path they always did, passing the bakery where the smell of bread rose warm and sweet against the cold, the soft clatter of trays, and the quiet hum of conversation slipping through the door each time it opened to release a customer back into the morning. I nodded to the woman behind the counter through the glass, catching her eye just long enough to see her small smile, the way her gaze seemed to rest for a moment on the place where the watch hid in my coat, as if she could hear it too, the steady hum that was no longer only mine. I kept walking past windows that blinked their reflections back at me, past the iron fence that edged the small park where the benches still held the memory of yesterday's rain in their damp wood, past the corner where the streetlight flickered twice, then steadied its glow, as if to remind me that the hush could live here too, in the hum of electricity and the quiet breath of a city waking slow. When I reached the library steps, they felt familiar beneath my shoes, the cold stone worn smooth by years of people who had climbed them with questions they did not know how to ask, until they found themselves standing under that high arch where the hush gathered like dust in corners no one thought to sweep away. Inside, the warmth wrapped around me at once, the soft smell of paper and would polish, and something older that might have been the memory of old ink or the breath of pages turned and forgotten. The librarian was there behind her desk, as if she had always been there, her glasses perched at the end of her nose, her eyes lifting to catch mine, and hold them in that way. She had that gentle way of asking without asking, of telling me she knew even when I said nothing at all. She did not speak, but I felt her voice, in the hush that slipped between us, a question and an answer folded together like two wings beating once, then settling back into stillness. I moved past her, without needing permission, my steps carrying me to the stairs, my hand brushing the banister that had learned the shape of my palm over so many climbs up to the clock that waited the same way the watch did, with no rush, no demand, only the soft promise that its frozen hands were not broken, just listening in a language that did not need seconds to speak. I stood before it for a long moment, the cold brass of its face catching the faint light from the high window, dust drifting through the beam like tiny echoes of the hush that lived behind its glass. I slipped my hand into my pocket, feeling the button warm there, the watch humming steady against my fingers, as if to say, "You brought it all with you," the hush, the hum, the question, the promise. I did not open the watch this time. I did not press the button to the glass. Instead, I closed my eyes and leaned forward until my forehead touched the cool brass, letting the hush slip through the cold into my skin until it settled deep behind my ribs, where it had always belonged. When I stepped back, I did not expect the hands to move. I did not look for a shift in the frozen hour. I only felt the hush settle softer inside me, carried in them. I carried the hush with me down the library steps, feeling it settle deeper with every soft click of my shoes on the cold stone, as if the building itself was reminding me not to rush the leaving, because even an exit has its own kind of quiet that deserves to be noticed. The morning outside had softened while I was inside, the edges of the sky smudged with a pale brightness that promised warmth, though the air still held that thin, crisp bite that slipped easily under a collar and made the bones beneath your skin remember that you are more awake than you want to admit. I paused at the bottom of the steps and turned back for a breath, half expecting to see the librarian framed in the glass of the tall door, her hands folded in that patient way of hers, her eyes asking me without words if I would come back again, if I would remember that the hush was not a gift she gave me, but a door I had found slightly ajar by listening when the rest of the world told me to fill the space with noise instead. I did not see her there, but I felt her presence all the same, not in the way people feel watched, but in the way a house remembers the weight of someone's footsteps long after they have slipped off their shoes and gone to bed, leaving behind a warmth that takes its time settling into the wood and the walls. I stepped away from the building, letting the hush follow me down the street, where the wind tugged at the loose corner of my scarf and rattled the bare branches that reached out from the small square of park across the way. I thought of the bench under the old oak, the way the grain of the wood pressed cold against my back the last time I sat there, the feather resting in my coat pocket, the watch ticking its soft heartbeat into the hush that folded the birdsong and the distant hum of passing cars into something that felt almost like permission to stand still without apology. I crossed the street to the park gate, the iron latch squeaking its gentle protest. When I pressed it open, the same protest it had offered every time I stepped through since I first learned that a bit of rust can carry its own song if you listen closely enough. The grass was damp from the night, and the path slick in places where fallen leaves had pressed themselves flat into small offerings for the soil that waited underneath to wake when the warmth finally decided to stay for good. I did not sit this time, but walked the narrow circle of the path, instead, one hand buried deep in my pocket, where the watch rested warm against my palm, the button, a small coin of comfort, pressed between two fingers, as if its spiral might teach me something about moving forward without forgetting how to pause. I let my feet find their rhythm in the hush of the park, the slow measured sound of steps softened by the wet earth, and the memory of last night's rain. I wondered then if the hush could ever run out, if one day I might wake to find the watch silent, the button cool to the touch, the feather gone from its place in my notebook, leaving only an echo of something I once understood, but could not remember how to hold. But the thought slipped away as quickly as it came, caught up in the gentle hush of wind through the trees, and the quiet promise the watch made each time it ticked its tiny circle just beneath my fingertips. I left the park before the sun rose high enough to draw people out with dogs and small cups of coffee and conversations about nothing in particular that always felt a little too sharp for a place that had taught me how to listen for the softest part of the day. The streets were fuller now, the morning awake enough that windows glowed with the warmth of shops, and the slow drift of people carrying bags and keys, and folded newspapers they would hold, like shields against the unexpected hush that sometimes slipped between their sentences when they paused long enough to feel it. I passed the bakery, and caught the scent of sweet bread carried out into the street by the steady swing of the door, as customers came and went, each one letting a little more of the warmth drift past me where I stood for a moment in the thin spill of sun that touched the sidewalk in a small bright shape that reminded me of the way light fell through the high window above the cracked clock in that hidden room behind the green door. I wondered if someone was there now, a curious stranger tracing the shape of the jars, with their eyes listening for the hush that lived in the faint memory of questions too soft to speak out loud. Maybe the librarian was standing just beyond the frame of that door, her hands resting on the glass of the clock, her breath steady and calm as she waited for the hum to find its way into the ribs of someone new, someone willing to lean in and listen without asking what they might hear in return. I stepped away from the bakery, letting the scent follow me down the street, like a reminder that even small comforts are part of the hush if you let them be. I did not go home yet, though I could feel the attic room tugging at the edge of my thoughts, the small square of window that would catch the last of the morning light, the desk where the notebook waited with its feather tucked carefully between pages that had begun to curl at the corners from the damp, and the steady warmth of my fingertips whenever I lifted the cover to read my own words as if they had been written by someone else long ago. Instead, I turned down a street I rarely walked, a narrow lane lined with houses that leaned into each other in that familiar city way, as if they knew the wind could slip between their bricks and rattle the bones of their walls if they did not stand close enough to keep the hush inside where it belonged. I found myself stopping in front of a small second-hand shop, its windows crowded with clocks of all shapes and sizes, their faces soft with dust, their hands frozen in a dozen different moments that no one seemed in any hurry to wind back to life. I pressed my palm to the cool glass, feeling the hush inside me meet the hush inside the window where the clocks waited, not to be fixed but simply to be noticed for what they were, quiet keepers of forgotten seconds that might still hold their shape if someone cared enough to listen. I stepped inside when the door gave way with a gentle chime that felt softer than it should have in the hush that greeted me like an old friend. The shop smelled of wood polish and old paper, and something that reminded me of the library, though I knew it was not the same. I drifted between the shelves, my eyes tracing the frozen faces of the clocks, the curve of their hands, the soft reflection of my own shape bent into the glass, like an echo waiting to unfold. When I stepped out of the little shop with its quiet congregation of clocks, I felt the hush settle deeper around my shoulders, like a coat I had always worn, but only now remembered how to fasten at the throat. The street outside was brighter now, the sun slipping through the bare branches above the row of old houses leaning into each other, their bricks warmed by years of rain, and stories told behind curtained windows. I walked slow, feeling the weight of the watch steady in my pocket, the button warm against my palm, pressing its small spiral into the skin there, as if to remind me that this hush I carried did not live in the library alone, or in the hidden round room with its cracked clock and breathing jars, but here too in the slow measure of my footsteps on a street that had learned to hold secrets in its crooked cobblestones. I paused at the end of the block where the street opened out into a small square lined with benches and a stone fountain that no longer worked, the bowl of it filled with leaves and rainwater, and once maybe coins tossed by people who believed wishes could float on metal if you whispered them into cold water, and turned away before you saw whether they sank or held their shine. I sat on one of the benches close enough to see my reflection in the shallow pool, where the light caught the surface and broke it into small pieces that moved each time the wind brushed past. I reached into my pocket and drew out the button, turning it over in my palm, feeling the warmth it had gathered from my walk, the spiral catching the sun and bending it back toward my eyes. I thought of the first time I pressed it to the glass face of the clock in the library, how the hands had not moved but something else had shifted inside me, the faintest tilt of thought, the hush leaning in closer than it ever had before, as if to say the trick is not in the ticking, it never was, the trick is in the listening. I closed my eyes for a breath, and felt the bench beneath me cold through my coat, the weight of the watch pulling gently at the fabric, where it rested like a heartbeat. I did not need to measure to know it was there. In the quiet, I let my mind drift back through the hallways of the library, the worn stairs, the echo of my own steps, finding the hush in the way the shelves stood so still they might have been listening too. I thought of the librarian, her voice, always softer than the sound of pages turning, her eyes catching mine across the wide room, filled with words that felt too small to hold the hum we never spoke of out loud. I wondered where she was now, if she stood behind her desk with her ledgers open, tracing lines that did not count debts or fines but promises made in the hush between the sound of shoes on marble and the distant creak of the old clock above our heads. Maybe she was in the round room behind the green door, her hand resting on the cracked clock's face, her breath folded into the hush that settled there like a blanket drawn up under the chin of night. I wondered if she ever pressed her ear to the glass the way I had, listening for something more than the small shifting of gears, listening for the truth that time does not care if we watch it, that it folds itself around us whether we pay attention or not, like light bending through old glass to land on a desk where a notebook waits, half filled with questions that will never be answered but always heard. A breeze lifted through the square, carrying the sharp scent of rain that had not yet fallen, the promise of it caught in the soft sweep of leaves along the edge of the fountain, where the water quivered at the touch. I opened my eyes and watched a single drop slip from the lip of the stone to join the shallow pool below, sending out ripples that broke my reflection into something I barely recognized, a face softened by the hush I had learned to carry through every room, every street, every quiet step between dusk and dawn. I pressed the button to my lips for a moment, feeling its warmth there, the faint impression of the spiral against the skin, as if to say, remember this, remember how the hush is not something you find behind a door or tucked inside a broken clock, but here in the soft place between your ribs, where the hum lives even when the city roars and the days stack themselves into worries you have no name for. I slipped the button back into my pocket and stood letting my hands find their place inside the folds of my coat, where the watch waited patient as ever, its small whisper slipping through the fabric like a voice that did not need words to remind me I was not lost, only walking slowly enough to feel the hush settle where it belonged. I left the square behind me, the fountain and its drowned coins, the benches that held the shape of my shoulders, and the warmth of my breath in the cold air. I walked through streets that bent and straightened again, as if the city itself was shifting under my feet, trying to guide me back to where I always ended up, no matter how far I drifted. When I reached the park gate, it opened with its usual squeak, the iron hinge singing its small familiar note that felt softer now than it had the first time I heard it, standing here with a hush so new it nearly slipped through my hands, like water poured too quickly from a cup. I stepped along the path that curved beneath the old oak where the bench waited, though I did not sit this time. Instead, I lifted my gaze to the branches above, where the first shy buds had begun to open small green secrets against the gray sky. A bird shifted there, watching me with eyes that did not blink the way people's eyes do, but stayed wide and soft, as if it too could feel the hum rising from the ground through my shoes into my chest, where it folded itself around the shape of my breath. I did not speak to it, though I thought for a moment I might. I let the hush say whatever needed saying, instead letting it pass between us like a thread unbroken by language or distance. When the bird lifted away, its wings brushed the air into a hush of their own, the faint sound folding into the memory of the watches tick, the cracked clock's hum, the soft exhale of the jars in the round room behind the green door. I walked home as the sky opened above me, the first drops of rain catching the shoulders of my coat, the rim of my collar, the faint warmth of my hands tucked deep in my pockets, where the button waited, the spiral pressed close, the watch counting not seconds, but the hush that stretched between each footstep and the next, reminding me that the trick was never about time moving forward or. The attic greeted me with the familiar hush that settled in the beams and the dusty corners, and the way the window rattled faintly when the wind slipped through the loose frame, just to remind the glass that it was still doing its quiet work of holding the world at bay. I shrugged off my coat and laid it over the back of the chair where it always rested when I came home, pockets heavy with the small warmth of the watch and the button pressed together like two pieces of the same old question that had followed me from the marble floors of the library to the soft damp paths of the park and back again to this narrow room that had never asked me for more than to sit and listen. I stood for a moment at the window, watching the rain slide down in thin veins that blurred the shape of the street below until the cars and the rooftops and the trees at the far end of the block folded into each other like colors on a damp page. I rested my forehead against the glass, feeling its chill seep through my skin into the hum that waited behind my ribs, and I wondered if maybe this hush I had learned to carry would one day drift out through the window like a ghost of breath left behind when you are too tired to remember how to hold it. I pressed my fingers to the window, leaving small prints that fogged over, then vanished as quickly as they had come, reminders that not everything that touches you leaves a mark you can see when the day slips its hands back into the pockets of dusk. I turned from the window and crossed the floor where the boards creaked under my steps like old friends shifting in their sleep, the radiator sighing in the corner, its warmth rising slow but steady, a heartbeat I could hear if I pressed my ear to the metal, though tonight I only let it hum from a distance. I settled at the desk and opened the notebook where the feather still waited, its fine edge tucked into the spine like a blade too soft to cut anything but the hush itself when the room grew too quiet for even the watch to fill. I ran my fingertip along the page where the last line had trailed off mid-thought, a curve of ink that dipped down and stopped, as if it had heard something and gone still to listen. I thought about lifting my pen, pressing its tip to the paper to finish that thought or begin another, but the hush pressed closer around my shoulders, and I let it be for now, trusting that whatever words needed to come back would find me when I was ready to listen for them. I pulled the watch from my pocket and set it on the desk, the soft tick folding into the hush of the room in a way that made me think of the cracked clock in the hidden room behind the green door, its silent hands never moving yet always pointing somewhere I could not see. I wondered what the librarian was doing now, if she stood alone in that round room, her fingers brushing the dusty shelves where the jars lined up like small breaths caught in glass, her ear tilted toward the clock as if she could hear the hum that lived at its broken center, the same hum that found its way into my chest each time I pressed my forehead to the cold brass face and asked it for nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat echoed back to me softer than before. I picked up the button and turned it over in my palm, the spiral warm against my skin as if it had soaked in all the warmth from my walk from the park bench, from the hush that drifted with me down rain-washed streets and past the small shops with their soft lamps and quiet windows. I held it close to the watch for a moment and thought of the time I pressed it to the clock's glass, how the hands never moved, but something inside me had shifted, the faint click of a gear turning that had nothing to do with seconds and everything to do with a part of me that remembered how to stand still long enough to feel the hush slip between the floorboards and the breath that rose and fell in the shape of my chest. I placed the button beside the watch and leaned back in my chair, letting my head rest against the wall, the hush gathering in the corners of the room, like dust gathering in the hollows of rooftops, where the rain dripped down to kiss the stone one last time before sliding away into the soft shadows that waited at the edges of the street. I thought about the park gate and the way it always sang its small rusted song when I passed through, how the bench beneath the old oak held the shape of my shoulders even after I stood, how the fountain's cracked stone caught the sky in its shallow bowl, reflecting not the clouds above, but the hush beneath them, the part of the world that never needed rain to remember how to be quiet. I wondered if the hush would ever leave me, if one day I would wake and find the watch silent, the button cool, the feather blown away by some careless draft that slipped through the attic window. But the thought faded as quickly as it came, because the hush was not a thing that could slip out like breath. It was the breath itself, the hum behind the pipes, the tick inside the watch, the silence that folded into every question I wrote and left unfinished in the notebook, that waited without complaint for me to remember how to ask. I closed my eyes and let the hush hold me there, the sound of rain at the window, the radiator's steady sigh, the soft shape of the watch's tick counting not seconds, but the space between them, the part of time that has nothing to do with clocks or calendars, but lives instead in the quiet pulse beneath my ribs, the part that hums when the world is too tired to shout. I thought of the librarian one last time, the green door, the cracked clock, the jars that lined the shelves like lungs learning to breathe in a circle of stone and shadows and old warmth. I wondered if she would ever find the note I would leave for her tucked inside the cover of a book no one ever checked out, a line that said simply, "Thank you for the hush, for the trick, for the question that does not end." When I opened my eyes, the rain was softer now, the window pane blurred by small rivers that caught the street lamp's glow and bent it into threads of gold that drifted across the walls, the ceiling, the open notebook, where the feather lay waiting for the page to turn. I did not reach for the pen tonight. I did not need to, because the hush had already written its shape behind my eyes, folding itself into the slow rise and fall of my breath, the way the pipes hummed, the way the watch ticked, the way the button pressed its warm spiral into my palm, like a promise that tomorrow, or the day after, or some night, when the rain was kinder and the world quieter, I would find the words again, and know they were not mine alone, but shared with every hush that had ever slipped between the seconds to remind me that time is a trick, and I was never lost, only listening. I woke before the sun this time, not because a noise pulled me from sleep or the cold found its way through the gaps in the attic window, but because the hush inside my chest was awake and waiting, humming softly in that place behind my ribs where my breath lives when I am too still to pretend I am somewhere else. I lay there for a long moment, feeling the shape of the blanket pulled up around my shoulders, the slight weight of the watch in the pocket of my coat draped over the chair by the desk, the feather tucked still in the fold of my notebook, its fine edge pressed flat where I left it after closing the cover, with the thought that maybe tonight I would find the right question to place beneath it. The radiator had cooled in the night, its pipes no longer ticking with their soft metal heartbeat, but I knew that once the morning stretched its thin fingers through the walls and found the old furnace again, the hush would slip back into the warmth rising up through the floorboards curling around my ankles when I crossed to the window. I pushed back the blanket and stood barefoot on the cold boards, feeling their creak settle into the hush instead of breaking it the way I once believed noise might do. Some things I have learned do not interrupt the hush, but invite it to settle deeper, the soft groan of old with the hush of breath against glass, when you lean close enough to watch the night slip backward from the edge of the roof, where the frost gathers like forgotten feathers. I pressed my palm to the window, watching my skin fog the glass before fading to show me the faint glow of the street lamp outside, the slow drift of a single leaf spinning down to the wet pavement below. I wondered if the librarian was awake in her small room above the stacks, perhaps sitting by her own window, with the hush pressed to her lips, like a cup of tea too warm to drink right away, her eyes catching the dim outline of the clock she keeps by her bed, a clock that I like to think does not tick at all, but hums the way mine does when I slip it from my pocket and hold it close enough to feel the soft murmur of time pretending to stand still. I crossed to the desk and opened the notebook, not to write, but to lift the feather and hold it against the pale light slipping through the window, the edges of it catching that thin brightness, the way the jars on their shelves in the round room catch the hush and keep it safe for someone else to find when they are ready to press their ear to the cracked clock's face and hear the hum that never needed hands to measure anything. I thought of that round room behind the green door, the smooth shape of the jars lined up like small lungs, breathing slow and patient in the quiet that has learned not to rush, no matter how many footsteps pause on the other side of the door, afraid to turn the knob, because once you step inside you do not step out the same. I wondered if one day I would go back there, not to ask, but to listen without needing a question ready in my mouth. Maybe I would sit cross-legged on the cold stone floor and rest my back against the wall and close my eyes until the hush curled up around my shoulders, like a sleeping cat content to purr without asking for anything in return. The feather trembled in my fingers when the wind brushed against the window, rattling the loose pane just enough to remind me that even when we seal ourselves away, the world finds its way in with its drafts and its small shifts in air, its soft reminder that the hush is never locked behind walls, but waiting in the places we forget to look when we rush to fill the silence with the noise of our own voices. I placed the feather back in the notebook and closed it, gently pressing my palm to the cover, feeling the slight rise where the pages swelled from the damp that always found its way through the roof on nights when the rain fell sideways and asked the attic beams to remember how to creak like the hold of an old ship. I pulled on my coat, the watch slipping back into the familiar weight against my hip, the button warm already, as if it had caught some small spark of my breath while I slept. I tucked my hands deep into my pockets, feeling the spiral press against my palm, the steady hum of the watch close enough to remind me that time has never really asked for our permission to pass, only our willingness to listen when it hums soft as a whisper in the dark. I stepped down the narrow stairs, careful not to wake the hush that had settled there between the steps where the boards bowed inward from all the years of feet pressing them toward the earth. Outside, the street was empty except for the soft echo of my breath drifting ahead of me like a ghost made only of warmth and promise. The lamp above the corner flickered once, then stilled its light, steady in the soft drift of early gray that comes just before the sky decides whether it wants to brighten or fold back into itself for a few moments more. I turned toward the library, though I knew the doors would be locked still, the marble steps gathering dew in the hush before the city woke and spread its noise back into the cracks we spend our days trying to fill. I stood across from the building, staring up at the high windows where the shelves waited, their rows of books pressed together like old friends keeping secrets in languages that do not need speaking when the hush is enough. I imagine the librarian inside moving through the stacks, her fingers brushing each spine, her breath quiet in the same way the jars breathe in the round room, that hum beneath a cracked clock folding into her chest the same way it folds into mine. I did not cross the street or climb the steps. Instead, I pressed my palm to the cold stone of the low wall that ran along the front garden where no flowers grew, but the hush did anyway, slipping between the weeds and the cracks where the moss gathered its soft green hush beneath the drip of last night's rain. I closed my eyes there, my fingers cold against the stone, the watch ticking not loud enough to compete with the soft murmur of the wind, but clear enough that I felt it settle my breath into a rhythm that needed no counting to keep time. I thought then that maybe this was the trick all along, not that time plays with us, but that we play with time, learning to stand so still the hush wraps itself around us, like an answer that does not care for the question, only the listening. I opened my eyes to the soft light of the street lamp fading against the first shy stretch of dawn above the rooftops, the city breathing deeper now, as the pipes below the streets found their voice, and the windows above blinked open to the world waiting to be filled again with the sound of footsteps and morning voices, and radios humming someone else's hush through thin walls. I turned from the library steps and walked home slowly, letting my breath drift ahead of me, my pockets heavy with the warmth of the watch, the quiet shape of the button, the hum behind my ribs promising that when I stepped back into the attic room and found my desk waiting, the notebook open to the page where the feather lay, I would know without needing to write it down that the hush was always the answer, and the question both the trick and the promise that if I listen long enough it will always find its way back to me, soft and unhurried as light bending through glass to find the shape of my breath waiting in the quiet I carry like a secret that does not need to be kept to stay true. I woke before the sun this time, not because a noise pulled me from sleep or the cold found its way through the gaps in the attic window, but because the hush inside my chest was awake and waiting, humming softly in that place behind my ribs where my breath lives when I am too still to pretend I am somewhere else. I lay there for a long moment, feeling the shape of the blanket pulled up around my shoulders, the slight weight of the watch in the pocket of my coat draped over the chair by the desk, the feather tucked still in the fold of my notebook, its fine edge pressed flat where I left it after closing the cover, with the thought that maybe tonight I would find the right question to place beneath it. The radiator had cooled in the night, its pipes no longer ticking with their soft metal heartbeat, but I knew that once the morning stretched its thin fingers through the walls and found the old furnace again, the hush would slip back into the warmth rising up through the floorboards curling around my ankles when I crossed to the window. I pushed back the blanket and stood barefoot on the cold boards, feeling their creak settle into the hush, instead of breaking it the way I once believed noise might do. Some things I have learned do not interrupt the hush, but invite it to settle deeper, the soft groan of old wood, the hush of breath against glass, when you lean close enough to watch the night slip backward from the edge of the roof, where the frost gathers like forgotten feathers. I pressed my palm to the window, watching my skin fog the glass before fading to show me the faint glow of the street lamp outside, the slow drift of a single leaf spinning down to the wet pavement below. I wondered if the librarian was awake in her small room above the stacks, perhaps sitting by her own window, with the hush pressed to her lips, like a cup of tea too warm to drink right away, her eyes catching the dim outline of the clock she keeps by her bed, a clock that I like to think does not tick at all, but hums the way mine does when I slip it from my pocket and hold it close enough to feel the soft murmur of time pretending to stand still. I crossed to the desk and opened the notebook, not to write, but to lift the feather and hold it against the pale light slipping through the window, the edges of it catching that thin brightness, the way the jars on their shelves in the round room catch the hush and keep it safe for someone else to find when they are ready to press their ear to the cracked clock's face and hear the hum that never needed hands to measure anything. I thought of that round room behind the green door, the smooth shape of the jars lined up, like small lungs breathing slow and patient in the quiet that has learned not to rush, no matter how many footsteps pause on the other side of the door, afraid to turn the knob, because once you step inside you do not step out the same. I wondered if one day I would go back there, not to ask, but to listen without needing a question ready in my mouth. Maybe I would sit cross-legged on the cold stone floor and rest my back against the wall and close my eyes until the hush curled up around my shoulders, like a sleeping cat content to purr without asking for anything in return. The feather trembled in my fingers when the wind brushed against the window, rattling the loose pane just enough to remind me that even when we seal ourselves away, the world finds its way in with its drafts and its small shifts in air, its soft reminder that the hush is never locked behind walls, but waiting in the places we forget to look when we rush to fill the silence with the noise of our own voices. I placed the feather back in the notebook and closed it, gently pressing my palm to the cover, feeling the slight rise where the pages swelled from the damp that always found its way through the roof on nights when the rain fell sideways and asked the attic beams to remember how to creak like the hold of an old ship. I pulled on my coat, the watch slipping back into the familiar weight against my hip, the button warm already, as if it had caught some small spark of my breath while I slept. I tucked my hands deep into my pockets, feeling the spiral press against my palm, the steady hum of the watch close enough to remind me that time has never really asked for our permission to pass, only our willingness to listen when it hums soft as a whisper in the dark. I stepped down the narrow stairs, careful not to wake the hush that had settled there between the steps, where the boards bowed inward from all the years of feet pressing them toward the earth. Outside, the street was empty except for the soft echo of my breath drifting ahead of me like a ghost made only of warmth and promise. The lamp above the corner flickered once, then stilled its light, steady in the soft drift of early gray that comes just before the sky decides whether it wants to brighten or fold back into itself for a few moments more. I turned toward the library, though I knew the doors would be locked still, the marble steps gathering dew in the hush before the city woke and spread its noise back into the cracks we spend our days trying to fill. I stood across from the building, staring up at the high windows where the shelves waited, their rows of books pressed together like old friends, keeping secrets in languages that do not need speaking when the hush is enough. I imagined the librarian inside, moving through the stacks, her fingers brushing each spine, her breath quiet in the same way the jars breathe in the round room that hum beneath the cracked clock, folding into her chest the same way it folds into mine. I did not cross the street or climb the steps. Instead, I pressed my palm to the cold stone of the low wall that ran along the front garden, where no flowers grew, but the hush did anyway, slipping between the weeds and the cracks where the moss gathered its soft green hush beneath the drip of last night's rain. I closed my eyes there, my fingers cold against the stone, the watch ticking, not loud enough to compete with the soft murmur of the wind, but clear enough that I felt it settle my breath into a rhythm that needed no counting to keep time. I thought then that maybe this was the trick all along, not that time plays with us, but that we play with time, learning to stand so still the hush wraps itself around us like an answer that does not care for the question, only the listening. I opened my eyes to the soft light of the street lamp fading against the first shy stretch of dawn above the rooftops, the city breathing deeper now as the pipes below the streets found their voice, and the windows above blinked